In the middle of the Sahara, there is a place where the houses are built out of salt. Not decorated with salt, built from it. Blocks cut from the ground, stacked into walls, roofed with camel skin because there is no wood, no trees, no grass. The water is bitter. Every scrap of food is carried in across the desert on the backs of animals. In 1352, a Moroccan traveler called Ibn Battuta stayed 10 days and wrote that the village had nothing good about it and was the most fly-ridden place he had ever seen. Its name was Tagaza. Men lived and died in it for one reason. Under the sand were slabs of rock salt, and 800 miles to the south were people who would pay gold for them. You have probably seen a number attached to this story: $400 billion. It is quoted in articles, in videos, in classrooms, and presented as the judgment of historians. It is not. That figure was published in 2012 by a website that estimates the net worth of celebrities. It was never a study, and the economic historians who work on this period decline to give any figure at all, because in an economy with no single currency, no capital market, and no line between a king's property and a state's revenue, personal wealth is not a quantity that exists. So the number tells us nothing about him. But between the salt, he did not dig, and the gold he never saw stood a man history calls the richest who ever lived. What exactly did he own? To answer that, you have to stop looking at the gold and start looking at the slope. Ibn Battuta gives us the number, and it is the most useful figure in this entire story. He watched salt move south out of Tagaza, and he recorded that by the time it reached the Malian capital, its price was 4 times what it had been at Walata, on the desert's edge. 4 times, over one stretch of road. Nothing had been added to the salt. It had not been improved or refined. It had been moved from a place where it was so common you could build a wall out of it to a place where the human body needed it and could not get it. The same thing happened in reverse. Gold that a farmer in the southern woodland dug out of a shallow pit a few grams at a time was worth a fortune by the time it reached Cairo, or Genoa, or Fez. Between those two slopes was a hinge, a band of savanna where the desert route met the river, where the salt coming down and the gold going up had to change hands. Mali was built on that hinge, not on a mine, on a gradient. Because Mali did not dig the gold. The metal came from 3 fields: Bambuk on the upper Senegal, Bure further southeast on the upper Niger, and later Lobi and the Akan forest further east still, which lay well beyond any Malian frontier. At Bambuk and Bure, the gold was won the hard way. Shafts a few meters deep, thousands of them, each yielding a few grams. The work was done by farming communities who had been doing it for centuries, who kept their own religion rather than the Islam of the court, and who lived in country that fell inside the empire's outline on a map and outside its administration in practice. The Mansas learned early not to push. Every account we have describes the same arrangement. The miners kept the mines, and the state took tribute and taxed the trade. And the miners kept something else. They never told anyone where the gold came from. Traders met them at fixed places, laid out salt and cloth, withdrew, and came back to find gold laid beside it. No conversation, no location. That silence was not superstition. It was the miners' only protection, and it worked so well that Europe spent the next 400 years guessing. The empire that taxed all this began, by tradition, with a battle. The story goes that a prince named Sundiata, exiled and sickly, returned to break the sorcerer king Sumang Guru at a place called Kirina, somewhere around 1235, and out of that victory built Mali. It is a magnificent story. You should also know exactly what it is. The Epic of Sundiata was not written down in the 13th century. It was published in 1960 by the historian Jibril Tamsir Nian, who transcribed it from a griot named Mamadou Kouyaté. Griots are professional keepers of lineage and memory, and they are very good at it. But the epic's job for 7 centuries was to explain why the Keita family had the right to rule. It is a charter. It is not a chronicle, and the two are not the same document. So what did Sundiata's successors actually build? Not a mine, not a monopoly on production. They built a customs house the size of Western Europe, tax on the caravans going north, tax on the caravans coming south, and in exchange, roads that were safe to travel. That mattered more than it sounds. A merchant crossing 1,000 miles of savannah with a fortune in gold dust wants one thing from a government, and it is not culture. It is a reasonable expectation of arriving alive. Mali sold that expectation, and it sold it better than anyone had before. By the time Musa came to the throne, around 1312, the machine was running at full power. The empire stretched from the Atlantic coast to beyond the bend of the Niger. Its markets at Jenne and Timbuktu handled the exchange. Its garrisons watched the roads. Its treasury took a percentage of everything that crossed. So we can strike the first line off the inventory. He did not own the mines. Nobody in his government had ever set foot in one, and if they had, the gold would have stopped coming. He owned a position. And a man whose entire wealth is a position has one absolute rule: never let anyone see how the trick works. Never show the size of the flow. In 1324, Mansa Musa broke that rule in the most spectacular way any ruler has ever broken anything. He went to Mecca. He was obliged to, as a Muslim who could afford the journey, and he was not the first Mansa to go. But nobody had ever gone like this. The accounts describe a column of tens of thousands. Soldiers, courtiers, servants, enslaved people, herds driven along for food, and camels loaded with gold. The most repeated figures are 60,000 people and 12,000 slaves. Treat those as impressions rather than a headcount. They were written down after the event by men who were not there, and they do not agree with each other. What is not in doubt is that the caravan was enormous and that it was meant to be seen. In July 1324, it reached Cairo, the largest and richest city in the Mediterranean world. There was an immediate diplomatic problem. Protocol required a visiting ruler to kiss the ground before the Sultan, and Musa, a sovereign in his own right, did not intend to. He was talked into it on religious grounds rather than political ones, which let everybody keep their dignity. Then he began giving gold away, not trading it, giving it. And here is where the story you have heard takes over. Every version of it says the same thing. Musa gave away so much gold that he crashed the Egyptian economy. The price of gold collapsed. It took Egypt 12 years to recover. One man's generosity broke a country. That claim comes from a single book. Its author was Shihab al-Umari, a scholar in the Mamluk administration, and his account is valuable. He went to Cairo. He sought out the officials and merchants who had dealt with the Malians, and he wrote down what they told him. But note 2 things. He was not there, and he was writing roughly 12 years after the event out of other people's memories. His figure is precise and worth hearing exactly. Before the Malians came, he says, a mithqal of gold never went below 25 silver dirhams and was usually worth more. Afterwards it fell, and it has stayed cheap, and now it does not exceed 22. And that, he writes, has been the state of things for about 12 years. That is the entire evidential basis for the most famous economic anecdote in African history. So a historian went and checked it against everything else the Mamluk sources say. Warren Schultz works on Mamluk monetary history, and he wrote a paper about this episode. What he found does not support the story as it is usually told. First, the size of the fall. 25 to 22 is a drop of about 12%, and the ordinary working range for silver against gold in Mamluk Cairo already ran between 20 and 25. The famous collapse sits inside the normal band. Second, the frequency. When you line up the exchange rates recorded for Cairo across the first half of the 14th century, the Musa episode is one of a whole series of short-term swings. It is not an outlier. Third and most damaging, the other sources do not blame him. Al-Makrizi, writing on the same period, puts a fall in the price of gold down to Mamluk, emirs dumping large quantities of jewelry onto the market. Al-Umari is the only surviving writer who pins a 12-year depression on Mansa Musa. The crash did not happen, which is more useful than if it had. Because if Musa's gold did not move the Cairo market, the story tells us nothing about how much gold he had. It tells us something else and something better. It tells us how steep the slope was. Think about what it takes for a foreign visit to be remembered as an economic event for 12 years, in a city that saw caravans every week. It does not require a crash. It requires astonishment. And astonishment is a measurement. It records the distance between what gold was worth where Musa came from and what it was worth where he was standing. Which is exactly what the 400 billion turns out to be. Both numbers are absurd. Both are useless as inventories, and both are excellent thermometers of a gradient. The proof arrives on the way home. Somewhere between Mecca and the Sahara, the richest man in history ran out of money. His people had been robbed, had died, had eaten through the supplies. And in Cairo, the sources report he borrowed from merchants. Some accounts say he was buying his own gold back and paying badly for it. Strike the second line. He did not own the price of gold, he stood on it. He came home with less than he left with. He also came home with the one thing that would outlast everything else he ever touched. On the return leg, he passed through Gao and through a river town at the desert's edge called Timbuktu, and he brought people with him. Scholars, legal specialists, and by tradition an architect hired in Cairo. In 1325, he commissioned Timbuktu's first great mosque, the Jenne-Jeno. It is still standing. It is built of mud brick over a timber frame, replastered by the whole town every year, and it has been maintained continuously for 700 years. He bought books. He endowed teaching. He connected a provincial trading post on the Niger to the scholarly networks of Cairo and Fez, and he did it with money that would otherwise have bought horses. This is the part of the story everyone likes, and it deserves to be liked. It is also the part where the popular version quietly loses 200 years. Because the Timbuktu you are picturing is not his. Here is the timeline nobody puts in the thumbnail. Musa built the Jenne-Jeno in 1325. The other two great mosques of Timbuktu, Sankore and Sidi Yahya, went up more than a century later, between 1433 and 1468, under a Tuareg chief named Akil. And the Tuareg held Timbuktu at that point, because they had taken it from Mali. The university everyone means when they say Sankore, the one with thousands of students and hundreds of Quranic schools, is later still. Timbuktu's golden age was the 16th century, under the Songhai Empire, the state that finished Mali off. Its greatest scholar, Ahmad Baba, was born in 1556. That is over 200 years after Musa died. We even have an eyewitness for the gap. Ibn Battuta reached Timbuktu in 1353, 28 years after the mosque went up. He had seen Cairo, Damascus, Delhi, and Constantinople, and he was not impressed. He gives the place a few sentences and moves on. So the mosque is real, the endowment is real, and the legendary city of scholars is real. It just belongs to the people who came next. That is not a debunking. It is the third line of the inventory, and it is the strangest one. Everything else Mansa Musa had was flow. Tax revenue that existed only while the caravans moved. Tribute that arrived only while the miners cooperated. Prestige that lasted only while the gold kept going north. The books were the one thing he converted out of the flow and into a stock. Something that sat still, accumulated, and could be held. And it worked. It worked so well that it outlived his empire by 300 years, survived a Moroccan invasion, survived colonization, and in 2012 went out of Timbuktu in trunks, carried by the descendants of the same scholarly families, ahead of men who had come to burn it. But look at who collected the interest. Not Mali, the Tuareg who took the city, and then the Songhai who took it from them. The one asset he owned outright was inherited by the people who evicted him. Everything else had to be rented, and the most important item on the list had to be rented again every single year and paid for in human beings. Mali's army had infantry and archers and levies raised from the provinces, but the instrument that made it an empire rather than a large kingdom was cavalry. Horsemen were how you reached a province 800 miles away in time to matter, how you collected tribute from people who would rather not pay it, how you kept a caravan route open, how you arrived somewhere before the news of your coming did. And Mali could not breed them, not in the numbers required. The war horses that mattered were North African stock, brought down through the desert from Morocco and from breeding grounds along the Saharan edge. In the Sahel, they did not thrive. They sickened, and they died, and the further south you went, the faster it happened, because in the wetter country to the south lies the range of the tsetse fly, whose parasite kills horses and cattle. So the cavalry was not a fleet you build once. It was a consumable, a subscription. Every year more animals had to come across the desert, and every year they had to be paid for. Paid for with what? Gold in part. But gold was what the North wanted least at the margin, because the North already had Malian gold. What the desert traders wanted, across centuries, is documented plainly, and there is no polite way to phrase it. They wanted people. The trans-Saharan trade moved gold, salt, copper, cloth, and enslaved human beings, and the exchange of captives for horses is one of its most persistent features. Rulers across the Sahel raided, took prisoners, and sent them north across the sand in return for the animals that let them raid again. It is a closed loop, and Mali ran inside it. This is not a footnote to the story of the richest man in history. It is the mechanism of his power. The cavalry that held the empire together was bought, in part, with the empire's own people, and with the people of everyone it could reach. Michael Gomez has argued that the question of who could lawfully be enslaved became one of the organizing problems of West African statecraft, shaping ideas of ethnicity and caste centuries before Europeans reached the coast. It was not incidental, it was the accounting. Now put the horse and the goldfield on the same map, and you find the wall Mali could never get past. The horse cannot go south. South is where the tsetse belt begins, and south is where the gold is. In the forest country, gold could not even be carried by animal. It went north on the heads of human porters, walking, to reach the trading towns. The horse also cannot go north. North is the Sahara, and cavalry is useless in a place where the water is 9 days apart, and the camel is the only thing that works. So the empire could only exist in a strip, a band of savanna wide enough for grass and narrow enough to escape the flies. Everything Mali could conquer, it conquered, and then it stopped because the animal stopped. Look at what that means. Mali sat between the gold it lived on and the salt it lived on, and it could not physically take either one. It was locked in the middle of its own income, unable to reach either end of it, renting the means to hold the middle. What happened next is usually told as a collapse. It was not. Musa died around 1337. His brother Suleiman held the state together until about 1359, and Ibn Battuta, who met him, thought him a miser, which probably means he was trying to repair the accounts. After Suleiman, the succession broke. His son ruled 9 months. Musa's grandson took the throne by force and is remembered by Ibn Khaldun for selling the imperial regalia to North African merchants to pay his court. Around 1400, Gao revolted. In 1433, the Tuaregs took Timbuktu, and 3 years later, Walata, which cut Mali off from the northern caravan routes. Songhai, which had been a Malian dependency, broke away in the 1430s. Sunni Ali took Timbuktu in 1468, and Jenne in 1473. And here is the thing that matters: the trade did not stop. The salt still came south. The gold still went north. Jenne kept trading. Timbuktu did not decline after Mali lost it. Timbuktu had its greatest century after Mali lost it. Nothing collapsed, the tenant changed. Two serious objections stand against everything I have just argued, and both are worth more than a sentence. The first is Michael Gomez in African Dominion. His argument is that reducing Mali to a trading position is exactly the old era. It treats West African states as commercial accidents rather than as states, and the evidence is against me. Ibn Battuta, a professional judge, describes a functioning court, a qadi, an administration, roads so safe that he remarks on it, and a protocol of extraordinary formality. Gomez Mali is a state with its own ideology of rule, a governing class, and centuries of accumulated practice. The second objection is archaeological, and it is older and harder. Roderick and Susan McIntosh excavated Jenne-Jeno, the ancestor site of Jenne. What they found was ironworking from the 3rd century before Christ, a city of more than 30 hectares between 750 and 1100, and long-distance exchange in stone, iron, and copper, centuries before any Arab caravan arrived. The Middle Niger did not become complex because of trans-Saharan trade. It was complex first, and the trade came to it. I accept both. Neither one moves the verdict, and the second one carries it. To Gomez, I'm not arguing about whether Mali was a state. It plainly was. I am arguing about whether its fiscal and military instrument was owned or rented. There is a test for that, and it is an awkward one. Kanem-Bornu, further east, ran the same machine on the same imported horses and lasted 500 years longer because when the technology changed, it renewed the lease and bought in firearms and the men to teach them. Mali could not renew. The institutions were real. The instrument was never theirs. And to the Macintoshes, yes, and that is the answer. If the underlying economy was local, agricultural, and 1,000 years older than the gold, then the gold was a thin fiscal film over the top of it, which explains the one thing that otherwise makes no sense. An empire ended and nothing terrible happened because the empire was never the economy. It was the toll booth. He was not the richest man who ever lived. He owned the distance between two prices. And in the Sahara, men are still cutting salt out of the ground and it is still going south. The road is there. The salt is there. The only thing that vanished was the man who took a cut.